Crazy mother. After my father died in a car accident, my mother went crazy. She never thought about protecting me, but went crazy on her own. Every day, she would hold my father's clothes and wait for him on the roadside. Because the weather turned cold on the day my father had the accident, he said his hands were so cold that he couldn't work. My mother asked my father to come back to change clothes, but she didn't want my father to walk a few more steps, so she went to the gate of the community to wait. As a result, my father saw her when crossing the road, and waved to her with some emotion. A car ran a red light and rushed out. He fell in a pool of blood in front of my mother, and the blood splattered all over my mother and the coat. My mother was mentally ill from that day on. I hate her. Just because she was crazy and I was a child, the relatives in the family took all the compensation money away, saying that they would give us a little every month, but in fact, they had already been greedy. Because she went crazy, when I was studying every day, someone would come to the school and say that your mother was missing again and was looking for your father everywhere, so go and check it out quickly. I never had a good day since I was a child. I had to wash her and change her clothes every day, and tie her up with an iron chain and tie her up at the school gate. My classmates laughed when they saw her, saying that your mother was a dog and had to be tied up with a chain. Some naughty classmates would jump in front of my mother and bark at her. After my mother went crazy, she was very timid and would tremble all over when she was scared, but this made them laugh. I was ashamed and angry, but what could I do? The textbooks say not to bully disabled people, but in reality, there are a lot of people who bully disabled people. When I was so young, I realized that the world was different from what was written in ideology and morality. Of course I knew how embarrassing it was, but if I didn't tie her up, she would go everywhere to find her father and cause trouble for the family. My classmates were all mean, and laughed at me for being the son of a bitch. I could only fight with them and drive them away. But when their parents saw me, they would come up and kick and beat me. They called me an orphan and a bastard, and said that if I hurt their children, there would be no adults in the family to pay for it. I obviously have a mother, but I live like an orphan, and was beaten to the ground by their parents. My mother was tied to the door next to her, crying and saying, "Don't beat my child, I'll ask his father to reason with him." They laughed happily again, saying that your husband had died a long time ago. I was beaten so hard that I couldn't even get up, and no one came to help me get justice. At first I was so stupid that I even told the teacher and called the police. But the law stipulates that my aunt became my guardian. She only wanted to take my father's compensation and didn't want to take care of me at all. She always reconciled with people privately. She coveted my father's death benefits and let me get beaten outside. The law also gave her the compensation for others beating me. I once chased the police uncle, and I said that she would not give me the money, and asked if the compensation could be given to me directly. The police patiently comforted me and said no, and severely criticized my aunt for being nicer to the child. My aunt said yes again and again in front of the police, but as soon as the police left, she slapped me hard and warned me not to talk nonsense in front of the police. My mother saw me being beaten, and cried and said not to beat my child, I will find his father to reason. My aunt just looked at her with contempt and left. My mother rushed over to hug me, she touched my face, and asked me crying, "Baby, does it hurt?" I pushed her away fiercely. I said of course it hurts. Because you are crazy, because you are useless, your broken brain is so easy to go crazy. She didn't understand what I said, and wiped her tears, and muttered that it was cold. Let's go to send your father a coat. I watched her rummaging through the coat to find her father, and I hated it. I really wanted her to be hit by a car and die outside. If she died, I would be relieved. I have a mother, but I have become a son of a bitch in the eyes of others. This is the so-called world. I took care of my mother like this, so my academic performance was not good at all. I was smarter than anyone else and could learn anything at once, but I had no time to study at all. I either cooked for her or went out to find her when she got lost. I never gave up looking for her once. Because I knew that if I couldn't find her, she would be dragged away by other men and dragged into the alley. There are so many bastards in this world. Even some classmates who grew up and didn't learn well, also touched my mother. They were not afraid when they saw me coming, and they touched my mother's head, smiling and saying that they were touching a dog's head. Every time, I would fight for my mother. Every time, I would be beaten to the ground, and no one would help me to get justice. Day after day, year after year, I never had a happy day. I can't remember how many times I was bullied and wanted to buy a bottle of pesticide for my mother to drink, and then I would die. Until the day of the college entrance examination, I failed. I only had 1/10 of the study time of others, but I still got into college. Everyone said that if it wasn't for my mother, I would definitely be able to go to a key university. But my life ended just like that, because my aunt had inquired and found out that it was enough to finish junior high school. Legally, guardians have no obligation to support their children to go to college. If I couldn't get into a key university and get a full scholarship, I couldn't go to school. The day I got my transcript, my mother got lost again. I already knew where to find her. She was huddled on the side of the road, shivering in the rain, with water droplets dripping from the rain on her body, but she held my father's coat tightly in her arms and used her body temperature to warm the coat. She was crazy but recognized my grown-up appearance. When she saw me, she waved to me happily. I hated this scene. It was because she waved to my father that my father didn't see the car running a red light when crossing the road. I impatiently put her hand down, and she felt that my hand was very cold, and said distressfully, "Baby, are you cold? Put on your father's hand first." She put the warm coat in her arms on me. At this moment, I felt like crying. When my father just left, I was not even half the height of this coat. But now it fits me just right. I pushed her away fiercely, and couldn't help crying. She panicked and asked me why I was crying. I wiped away my tears and asked her, crying, "Starting tomorrow, I will go to work to support you. Why are you still alive? Why don't you die?" She was stunned, standing there at a loss, biting her fingers nervously. Since she went crazy, she was easily nervous and bit her nails countless times. In the past, I would always ask her not to bite her fingers, but today I was so upset that I cried. Everyone who bullied me can go to college and have a bright future, but I don't even have the qualifications to study. Why are bad people never punished? I have to take care of you since I was a child. I am so tired. Why don't you die early? My mother was very scared. She bit her nails and sobbed, but she couldn't say a complete sentence. She just sobbed, "My child, don't be angry. We will wait for your father to come." I was completely upset. I threw the report card in her face, crying, "Go to hell. You lose every day, go to hell, okay?" She was so panicked that she trembled on the spot, bit her nails, turned around and jogged, and looked back at me crying from time to time. I sat on the ground helplessly, like a helpless child, buried my head, and cried. When I raised my head again, my mother was gone. I wiped my tears and endured the pain to find her. But for some reason, I couldn't find her that day. No matter how I searched every street in the town, I couldn't find her. Finally, the police called. They told me with regret that my mother was gone and asked me to go to the police station. I held the phone and stood there stupidly. I didn't think that this was my final farewell to my mother. When I saw my mother's body, she was salvaged from the river and covered with a white cloth. The white cloth did not cover her hands. All 10 fingers of those hands were bitten. An old lady who lived next door told us that she had seen my mother sitting here a long time ago, crying in the rain. She went up to ask my mother why she was crying, and my mother just kept shaking her head and crying that the baby didn't want me to live. She saw that my mother seemed to have some problems with her brain, so she didn't care. When she came out again, the body was floating on the river. I listened to her oral account and looked at my mother's body stupidly, and my head was buzzing and stunned. The image of her sitting by the river, crying and shaking, biting her nails nervously, flashed in my mind from time to time. They taught me how to apply for a death certificate and told me many things. I listened stupidly. Finally, I knelt beside my mother, lifted the white cloth, and looked at her pale face. Many times, I wanted to pull her to death. Now she is really gone, but my tears can't stop falling. My throat hurt so much, I hugged her and cried. I said sorry over and over again. I asked her why she really died. I begged her not to sleep, open her eyes and look at me, but she didn't respond to me. She would never talk to me again. When my aunt heard that my mother was gone, she quickly arranged the funeral. She didn't do it for us, but to collect funeral money. We buried my mother, and I looked at the portrait on the tombstone and couldn't stop crying. The funeral master came to my side, patted my shoulder, and comforted me not to be sad and to worship my parents well. He found me some paper money. I knelt in front of the grave, sobbed and said sorry, and then used fire to light the paper money. But the paper money wouldn't burn, so I handed it to the funeral master, saying it was damp and asked for another batch. He was puzzled and lit it, and it really couldn't burn. He muttered that it might be because of the rainy day, so he went to change a batch for me. But the new batch of paper money still couldn't burn. The funeral master saw that the new paper money didn't work, so he muttered and went to change it. After he walked out a few steps, he must have tried again and said that it lit this time. He came over with a brazier and asked me to be careful and burn it slowly. But when he approached the grave, the brazier suddenly went out. The funeral master was stunned, and his expression suddenly became very ugly. He said to me, "Baby, don't cry first, try to see if this incense can be lit." He took out a bunch of unopened incense and handed it to me. I tried to light it, but found that it didn't work. It's strange, this incense is newly opened, and it shouldn't be so easy to get damp. The master looked panicked. He took the incense and walked a few steps away to light it, then brought it back. When he came back, the incense was indeed extinguished. The master threw away the incense in his hand, and he said nervously, "Not eating incense in front of the grave, this is a big resentment." I was stunned. I asked the master what he meant. But he didn't care about me, and hurriedly asked my aunt, "How did the man of this family die?" My aunt said it was a car accident. When the funeral master heard it, he said anxiously, "Wrong, all wrong." He threw away the brazier and incense, which scared us. My aunt asked him nervously what was wrong. The funeral master panted and said, "You are in big trouble. The male owner died suddenly, and the female owner also died suddenly, but you buried the couple who died suddenly together. No, quickly dig out your mother's coffin and prepare a ghost coffin, otherwise something big will happen." I was stunned. Sending a ghost coffin is our custom here. As the name implies, it is not the deceased who is sent, but the ghost. I stared blankly at the portrait on the grave. Did my parents have a grudge against me? The master quickly called everyone to carry the coffin. These people were hired for money. When they heard that they were going to carry a ghost coffin, they were all unhappy. No one wants to get into trouble with this kind of thing. They said that they could carry the ghost coffin, but they had to pay extra, 20,000 yuan per person. There were 6 people in the coffin carrying team, which was 120,000 yuan. My aunt was dumbfounded when she heard this. She hurriedly asked the master what would happen if something big happened. The master said that when a fierce ghost is born, he will drag his flesh and blood to be buried with him. In order, it should be the eldest son and grandson, the eldest daughter and the second son. When he was halfway through, my aunt interrupted and asked, "Where is the sister of the deceased? Or the sister-in-law of the deceased?" The master shook his head and said that the sister was not inside. My aunt was relieved, and then she said to me seriously, "I have helped your family bury you. I have raised you for these years, and I have spent most of the compensation. I have done my best." After she finished speaking, she did not dare to cause trouble, and quickly took her family away. None of the relatives present were willing to help. When everyone heard that things were not going well, they all left with excuses. The funeral that was originally lively was left with only me and the funeral master. The master said to me anxiously, "Kid, if you can't pay and find someone to carry the coffin, you won't even survive tonight's return to the soul night." I shook my head and said that I had just graduated and had no money. He hesitated for a few seconds, and finally gritted his teeth and said, "Okay, since you are an orphan and pitiful, I will teach you a folk method, you must remember it well." The master told me that the so-called sending of the ghost coffin is to carry the coffin of the deceased to the place where she died after sunset and before midnight, and then offer the deceased a meal for the afterlife, and ask the deceased to eat the meal and go on the road. After the meal, the coffin must be buried before the cock crows. There are 2 points to pay special attention to. If you don't do it well, you will die. First, the rice should be half-cooked, and a raw egg should be beaten on top and a pair of chopsticks should be inserted. This is the rice for the afterlife. Second, no matter what happens, you can't make any sound during the whole process. You can only say "eat up and go on the road." Once you say something else, the ghost will be reluctant to leave and drag people to be buried with you. I said I remembered it, but I can't lift the coffin. What can I do? The master said that in ancient times, everyone suffered. Coffins were things that only wealthy families could afford. Didn't the poor people bury them? He told me that in the past, the poor people didn't use ghost coffins, but corpse carriers. Wrap the body with a straw mat and carry it to the location, that counts. If you survive tonight, the corpse carrier will be considered successful. After the master finished speaking, he left in a hurry. He didn't dare to cause trouble. We were not related. He taught me a folk method for free, which was already a kindness. I was the only one left in the huge graveyard. I once again understood what loneliness meant. I could only buy food by myself, cooked it half-cooked, and kicked the eggs in my pocket. The coffin had not been nailed on yet, so I waited until sunset to open it. When I shone the flashlight and opened the coffin, I was stunned. My mother had her eyes closed when she died. But now, my mother opened her eyes, but there were no pupils in her eyes. Her pale eyes stared at the outside. Even though this was my mother, my heart was trembling with fear. I stretched out my trembling hands to help her cover her eyes. But after I covered them, she opened her eyes again. Such a weird scene, in this deserted graveyard, I was the only witness. This sense of loneliness added to the fear in my heart. In fact, I think I deserve it. If I can't survive, it will be God's retribution to me. All I did was just for my mother, because the master told me that it is miserable to become a ghost. Evil ghosts cannot be reincarnated or go home. They have to repeat the scene of death every day and become the most miserable lonely ghosts. My life is worthless. If my mother wants me to pay back the debt, she can just take it. But no matter what, I want her to rest in peace. She has suffered enough in this life. I want her to be reincarnated into a good family. I carried my mother on my back and climbed out of the coffin. I look so embarrassed now. My mother is on my back, holding a flashlight in her mouth to light the way, with eggs in her pocket and a bowl of rice in her hand. The mountain road is very dark, and I take every step carefully. Because there is a ditch next to it, if I accidentally step on it, I will fall down with my mother. The master specifically told me that the feet of the dead must never touch the ground. The mountain road is difficult to walk at night. Because I hold the flashlight in my mouth, the moths, beetles, and other things in the mountains will hit my face from time to time in order to get close to the light source. Even if a blind fly flew into my mouth, I dared not flutter around, and could only swallow it with nausea. The corpse carrier carries the dead on his back and sends them to the paradise. No matter how much hardship he has to endure, he must complete his duties. But even so, a big moth flew into my mouth, and I had no choice but to spit out the flashlight and the moth together. The flashlight fell to the ground and shone on me. I bent down and bit the flashlight in embarrassment. The cold wind at night whistled and blew the wild grass in the mountains. I couldn't help but look to the side, but I was stunned. The flashlight just shone on me, and my shadow was cast on the mountain road. But the problem is that there is only me in that shadow. My mother's body, no shadow. I swallowed my saliva, suppressed my inner fear, bit the flashlight, and continued to move forward. The cold wind kept blowing on me, making my neck cold, but I didn't dare to look back. I was afraid of being blown out by ghosts. My master told me that, as the saying goes, people are 3 parts afraid of ghosts, and ghosts are 7 parts afraid of people, because people have yang energy. Yang energy gathers into 3 natal lamps, one on the top of the head and the other on the shoulders. If a ghost wants to harm a person, it must blow a breath behind him, but the ghost's energy is too weak to blow out the natal lamp. If a person turns around at this time, it will be over. The breeze he brought when he turned around, combined with the ghost's energy, just blew out the natal lamp. This is why you can't turn around casually when walking at night. I slowly went down the mountain, and the dogs raised in the village at the foot of the mountain saw me and barked. Dogs raised in rural areas are rarely tied up, and barking will attract dogs. They rushed out of their homes, surrounded me, growled, and barked at me vigilantly. I struggled to push them away with my feet. They seemed to be very afraid of my mother on my back. They wanted to pounce on me and bite me, but they didn't dare to move forward. Suddenly, a dog attacked from behind. I was afraid that it would bite my mother, so I turned around in a hurry. "It's over." I cried out in my heart that something was wrong. A strong chill swept over my whole body. I was alert a second ago, but it was as if I had lost all my strength and knelt softly on the ground. I was struck by a ghost. I knelt on the ground, and tried to bend over while losing my strength, because only by bending over could I prevent my mother's feet from falling to the ground. As soon as the dogs saw me fall, they all rushed over. I weakly raised my hand to drive them away, but then I realized that they were attracted by the rice for the afterlife. They ignored my drive and all rushed to the bag of rice. At this moment, I could only support my mother on my back with one hand and hide the rice for the afterlife in my arms with the other hand. The problem was that my body was so tired that I couldn't even open my eyes. After the natal lamp was blown out, I felt as if I had a serious illness. How could I have the strength to drive these dogs away? The heads of these dogs drilled into my arms, and their sharp teeth with saliva bit the bag hard. I only had one hand, I couldn't protect the bag was bitten, and the rice fell to the ground. The bowl broke. The rice fell to the ground, and soon the dogs surrounded the rice. If this rice was gone, where would I get new rice? In a hurry, I turned to the side and let my mother lie on the ground so that her feet would not touch the ground. Then I rushed to the dogs, trying to snatch the rice back. But these dogs rushed to eat. They are different from pet dogs. Pet dogs are trained not to guard food. Dogs raised in the countryside are not trained to do this. Because these dogs eat leftovers, who has nothing to do to snatch leftovers from dogs? These dogs are food guarding, and the dogs are afraid of my mother, not me. When I wanted to take the rice back, a dog bit my arm directly, making me bleed. I hit the dog's head madly, but I didn't have much strength. Now I couldn't even beat a dog, and this force angered it even more. It bit my arm, started shaking its head, and tore hard, trying to tear the flesh off my arm. It hurts. The pain of the torn muscles made me lose my mind. In a hurry, I couldn't help but yell, "Get out!" The dogs were frightened, but then my heart couldn't help but tremble. In a hurry, I actually spoke. "It's over." The rice for the dead was spilled, and I spoke. Because of the appearance of these dogs, I didn't do anything that the master had told me to do. Suddenly, the originally fierce dogs began to whimper one by one, looking behind me in horror. They slowly retreated, and I actually saw a scared expression on the dog's face. One dog ran first, and the others followed. I had a very bad premonition in my heart. I swallowed and turned around slowly. My mother was standing behind me. At this moment, her feet had touched the ground. She stood on tiptoe, her heels not touching the ground, her pupilless eyes staring at me. Fear spread in my heart. However, a special emotion overshadowed the fear, that is, my guilt towards my mother. That picture appeared in my mind again. The picture of my mother sitting by the river crying and trembling, biting her nails nervously, and finally chose to jump into the river to commit suicide. It was because I yelled at her hysterically and asked her to die that things became like this. When she appeared in front of me with such a look, I almost collapsed. I cried and trembled, and I said, "Mom, I'm sorry." I said it in anger, "I didn't really want you to die." Mom stared at me and walked towards me step by step. Her walking posture was very strange. Whenever the cold wind blew, she would sway slightly as if she had no weight, especially her feet stepping on the ground, silently. I got up with difficulty and wanted to escape, but I couldn't use any strength. "I'm not afraid of death, I just want her to rest in peace." The master said that evil spirits cannot be reincarnated. They will repeat the process of death every day and become lonely ghosts. My mother drowned. If I die in her hands today, she will repeat the process of drowning every day and will never be reborn. I gritted my teeth and took out the key from my pocket. I once asked the master what to do if I really failed. The master looked at me with a complicated expression at that time. He asked me if I really wanted my mother to rest in peace and reincarnate. I said yes, I really wanted to. The master told me that there is a kind of person that ghosts will not kill, that is, people who are on the verge of death. Because people who are on the verge of death will have a dead air on their bodies, which makes ghosts think they are the same kind. Endure the pain and weakness of dying and complete the task of carrying corpses. He told me that if I really failed, this is the only way to let my mother rest in peace. I looked at my mother and couldn't help crying. I cried and said, "Mom, I have been tying your hair, cooking for you, washing your clothes and folding your quilts since you were a child. I have taken care of you for 10 years, and I am so tired. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have treated you like that. You gave me my life, and today I will give it back to you, and we will end it all." I picked up the key, lifted my clothes, and aimed it at my stomach. My mother reached out to me, but before she could do anything, I had already stabbed the key into my stomach. It hurt so much. The key is not sharp at all, and the severe pain almost made me faint. People have fat in their stomachs, which makes their stomachs soft and elastic. In order for this key to penetrate my abdomen, I have to endure the pain and try to harden my muscles. The blood fell to the ground along the key, and I knelt on one knee in pain, and every pore in my head was numb. My body was warning me to stop quickly, but I still gritted my teeth and stabbed the whole key into my stomach. I raised my head tremblingly and looked at my mother. I endured the pain and murmured, "Mom, you took care of me before I was 8 years old, and I took care of you after I was 8 years old. It's been 10 years, and I will take care of you for the last time. My son made a mistake, and I will accompany you on the road with this life. I know I can speak now. Because at this moment, I am a dying person." The master said that ghosts will not attack their own kind, otherwise they will be shattered. I picked up the rice on the ground and put it in my pocket, walked towards my mother, and grabbed her arm directly. The severe pain from my abdomen made me doubt whether I could carry her to the river, but the moment I carried her on my back, I found that she had changed. She originally had weight. But now, she has become very light, as if she has no weight at all. The key is stuck in my stomach. Every time I take a step, the tearing pain brings me a burst of clarity to ensure that I will not faint. Blood dripped onto the ground. I didn't know how much blood I had shed. I was sometimes drowsy and sometimes sober. Walking on this road, my childhood flashed back to my mind. At that time, I was tired of walking and liked to act like a spoiled child with my parents. Dad always carried me on his back and let me lie on his broad back. I was not honest yet and liked to reach out to my mother and let her hold me. Our family of 3 walked on the path, with the smell of Dad's sweat and Mom's hair. Looking back, that was the smell of happiness. Now I am wearing Dad's coat and carrying Mom on my back. I wonder if this is a kind of reunion. Before a person dies, he will indeed walk around and see the lights, and the scenes of his life will emerge. I can't remember how long I walked, and I came to the river and knelt on the ground. I no longer have a bowl. I can only hold the rice for the afterlife in my hands, beat a raw egg on the rice, and stick the chopsticks up. I looked at my mother and forced a smile. I said to my mother, "Eat and get on the road." Ghosts don't eat, but they will accept offerings. The rice in my hand began to go bad and rot at a speed visible to the naked eye. Seeing this, I breathed a sigh of relief. This means that my mother accepted the rice for the afterlife. I gasped, not knowing if I still had the strength to return to the grave. But I wanted to try. At least in the end, if I could lie down next to my parents' graves and die, it should be a family reunion for us. I reached out my hand and wanted to carry my mother on my back again, but she suddenly moved. She took a step back. I was stunned and reached out to her again, but she stepped back again. She was getting closer and closer to the simple hut by the river. The old lady who saw her die was a scavenger who lived in this hut. I couldn't help but wonder, could it be that my mother wanted to harm a stranger? No, she shouldn't do this. How could she have resentment towards a stranger? But she grabbed the door and pushed it open. This simple hut itself was equipped with a door panel, which was easily pushed open. Suddenly, I smelled a strong smell of blood. I was stunned. In the hut, the old lady knelt on the bed and lay down. However, a pair of scissors was fixed on the bed. The scissors pierced her neck, and she died on the bed in a kneeling position. The bed and the floor were covered with her blood. I looked at this scene stupidly, and I couldn't believe what I saw. Mom suddenly picked up the mirror in the room and pointed it at me. I was reflected in the mirror, but there was more than me in the picture. On my body, there was even half a pale head. Yes, half a head. Blood was dripping. But that was someone I knew. That was the classmate who always bullied us in the past. He lay on my back, blowing air at my shoulders with his hideous and disgusting face. But because I didn't look back on this way, I didn't have two of my natal lamps blown out. For ghosts, hurting their own kind is to be shattered. The body of this classmate was gradually and slowly disappearing, so only half of his head was left. I watched him completely disappear and his soul was shattered. I don't understand why things have become like this. After my mother showed me the situation in the mirror, she took 2 steps forward and suddenly hugged me. Not cold. Maybe because my body temperature was also dropping, I felt that my mother was not cold at all. I felt her hug and tears fell uncontrollably. She just touched my head and looked at me kindly. At this time, my cell phone suddenly rang. I picked up the phone and found that it was a call from the funeral director. I picked up the phone and heard his anxious voice. Wrong. All wrong. Many people died. I received several guests in one night, all of whom died suddenly. I asked around and found that it was either your classmate or your aunt. I said blankly, is my aunt dead too? Dead? Where are you? Are you okay? I explained the matter to him. He said quickly, things may not be as they seem. Don't die. Ghosts can actually talk, but people and ghosts cannot talk. Once she talks to you, she will be attached to the world and want to take you on the road. She has been silent and let you see the ghost of your classmate, just to let you know that there is someone else who wants to kill you. Live. Don't die. Your mother wants you to live. I am not far from you. I will take you to the hospital on a motorcycle. The master kept talking, but I couldn't hear what he said later. I was bleeding all the way and was so tired that my eyes were black. I lost all my strength and wanted to fall down. My mother hugged me and let me lie softly in her arms. I looked at her kind face and whispered, Mom, won't you take me with you? She smiled and just shook her head at me. At this moment, I really burst into tears. I couldn't control myself and grabbed her and cried loudly, I'm sorry, I said those words in anger. I don't want you to die at all. For the past 10 years, I have been thinking about making money when I grow up, curing you, and turning you back into the mother you once were. I said the wrong thing. I don't want a future, I don't want any life, I just want you to stay with me. I cried in my mother's arms, and she actually shed tears. She cried with tears, kissed my forehead, and patted my back, just like when she coaxed me to sleep when I was a child. At this time, the funeral master arrived. He got off the motorcycle and ran to the river. When he saw the situation here, he opened his eyes wide in shock, and my mother's body began to have a milky white light. I asked the funeral master in panic, what's wrong with my mother? He said, your mother has no resentment in her body. She is going to be reincarnated. I grabbed my mother's hand, and the originally light hand began to gradually become heavier. Milky white light spots continued to emanate from my mother's body, surrounding me and hugging me like fireflies. The funeral master picked me up and let me sit on the motorcycle. He said to me anxiously, hold on, I will take you to the hospital immediately. He started the motorcycle, and those firefly-like lights were always by my side, following me all the way. Several times, I tried to catch them, but I couldn't. Until I was sent to the door of the hospital, these lights began to gradually dissipate. And I finally fainted. I survived in the end. The funeral master came to visit me in the hospital, and he told me that things had taken a turn for the better. There was a new witness who provided a different testimony from the old lady. The man was a fisherman. He thought it was good to fish on rainy days, so he went to the river to fish in the rain. When he was preparing, he saw my mother crying there, and my classmates passed by drunkenly after celebrating graduation and saw my mother. They came to bully people again. My mother was forced to run around and cried in fear. Every time in the past, I had a fight with these people. But this time, I was not there. My mother had no way to escape, so she chose to jump into the river in desperation. When those people saw that the matter had become serious, they knew that they were now adults and had to bear legal responsibility, so they hurried home to ask adults for help. The adults also came, and the old lady happened to see this scene. They thought that the old lady was the only witness. The fisherman was an avid enthusiast, and he came to fish even though he couldn't swim. He saw that someone had died and he didn't dare to show up because he couldn't swim, for fear of being retaliated. So the adults gave the old lady 3,000 yuan, and the old lady lied against her conscience. Overnight, all 5 families died. 3 families were my classmates, 1 family was the old lady, and the other family was my aunt. I was stunned. I couldn't help but say, but my mother has always been by my side to protect me. She is so busy that she can't hurt anyone. The funeral master said, there are more than just your mother buried in the grave. I was stunned. He continued, your father has never been reincarnated in these years, perhaps he wanted to wait for his wife and children to die peacefully. But his wife died suddenly and was buried, so he knew it. Instantly, I suddenly remembered that every time we were bullied in these years, my mother would cry and say, "I will ask his father to reason with me." At this moment, my father really came to reason with me. I asked the funeral master, "Do you think my mother will hate me?" The master said, "Yes." I felt lonely. "Then why didn't she take me away?" The funeral master said, "She probably hates you for taking care of her for 10 years. You have been taking care of her since she was a child, giving up your studies and yourself for her. She will hate herself for dragging you down and for taking care of her, but she will not hate your quarrels." I lowered my head, and my eyes were wet again. The funeral master patted my shoulder and sighed, "Don't look at what a person says, but look at what a person does. It is inevitable that family members will quarrel. You have taken care of your mother for 10 years. You are amazing. If you were my child, I would be proud of you. I would also be full of apologies to you. You have suffered in the past 10 years. Do you quarrel so fiercely with your parents?" He touched my head like a kind big brother and said softly, "No, because I had a good life when I was a child. You are different from me, poor child. I don't know if you have eaten candy, tasted snacks, or played with friends since you were a child." I wiped away my tears, pursed my lips, and tried not to cry out. I never ate. After the age of 8, I never ate a bite. I never played. After the age of 8, I was looking for my mother to go home with my eyes open and closed. I couldn't control my crying and trembled on the bed. The big brother just whispered, "Cry, your new life has begun." Auntie is gone. The whole family is gone. Over the years, her family used my father's compensation to buy a house and a car for my cousin. But overnight, because my uncle was the only son, I was the only heir left. I inherited the property of my aunt's family, and the things that belonged to me were finally returned. The funeral master asked me how I wanted to live in the future. I told him that I sold my aunt's house and car and got 2 million. I bought a farmhouse at the foot of the mountain. Farmhouses here are very cheap, only tens of thousands of yuan. I saved the rest of the money and didn't spend it. I stayed in this village, raised some chickens and ducks, and made some handicrafts to make money, which could support me for a lifetime. Every morning, I carried the things I needed for handicrafts and my lunch box up the mountain. I sat in front of my parents' graves and knitted handicrafts. Sometimes I could chat for a long time, and sometimes I had no topic, so I knitted quietly, letting the breeze blow, as if they were caressing my face. When I was tired, I lay down beside the grave and slept peacefully. I stayed at this grave to mourn, day after day, year after year. 5 years later, one night, before I could get down the mountain, the grave suddenly emitted a milky white light. I asked the funeral master what was going on. He said, "Your father has been reincarnated. He is reminding you that there is no one in the grave. Don't guard it anymore. He wants you to live a good life." I was silent. After such a life, I no longer have any expectations for the world. I thought seriously about how to live the rest of my life. In the end, I bought back my aunt's house. The house price fell. It was 1.9 million when it was sold 5 years ago. It cost 1 million to buy it back 5 years later. Although I was mourning, I made 900,000 inexplicably. So I applied for a very leisurely job with a low salary, but it was enough for me to live alone. Every day when I returned home, I played games, watched TV series, and burned incense on my parents' tablets before going to bed. Whenever I thought of the bullying I had suffered, I hated this world and had no intention of falling in love or struggling. This is probably how I will live my life.